Hello. How is everybody today? It's summer, it's the middle of July, and here we are having a campfire chat. Not around a real campfire, but hopefully this weekend and maybe this evening, some of you will be able to enjoy that. So, welcome. I am really excited to be here today. Thanks, Serena, for being our producer and coordinating this. I know, considering it's the middle of summer, we have quite a few people coming on. So, I hope you guys are able to really appreciate and enjoy the discussion I'm going to have with Brad Lennon about the donor journey. I'm Janine Purves, and I am a consultant with Donor Motivation Program. And as every single one of you on this call does, I also wear many hats. One of them is I am a cottager, and I absolutely love being around bonfires. So this is second nature to me. Um, with music usually, so I know last time I brought some music, but this time I didn't. Wasn't quite as organized. And I also wear another hat as an advisor at Asante. And that has been an amazing journey because I have been there well over 20 years. And for, I think, close to 20 of those, I have actually had Brad Lennon and his wife, Elizabeth Nyberg, as clients. And that has been an absolute treasure because they are wonderful people who really try to stay engaged in their community, and that's who I'm going to interview today. So, Brad Lennon is a retired Anglican priest who has been employed for nearly 40 years as a community worker, a social service executive director, and a pastor over local congregations. But to me, he's been a client who has always tried to do whatever he could to have impact and also just to try to make good logical decisions when it comes to his planning and for his future. And both he and his wife Elizabeth have always been engaged and interested in learning more about what can be done. Uh, and when it comes to this, and when it comes to planning, one of the things that's also important is whatever the client's goals are. And one of their goals was charitable giving. That's come up. So we're going to get into that discussion today. So without further ado, I want to introduce Brad Lennon. And
Hi,
Brad,
Janine.
maybe you can say hi to our audience.
Hello to all of you out there. I'm glad to join you around the campfire.
Yes. So thanks everybody for being here. And one of the things I know we do on these chats is what kind of interesting drinks are we able to have? So what I'm finding, maybe Brad, I'll ask you, what's your drink of choice today?
Well, my drink around the campfire would probably be water because I'd be joining you. Um I would be joining you from backpacking, which is what I usually has taken me out into the woods and has usually brought me around to join others with. And I guess water sounds like a pretty plain beverage, but one of the things we have to be careful with when we're backpacking and when we're out in the woods is we have to be careful about the quality of the water. And so one of the things I would have brought with me to along with the water is I would have brought my filter to filter the water. It's not enough to put chlorine into water to disinfect it, but what we have to do is we have to be able to filter out as well to things like giardia, which are not in particularly in areas that are infested by beaver, and they don't get killed by chlorine. So that's what my water filter. I've been pumping away, and I've pumped through the filter and filled up my flask here with water. So that's what I'm having today.
Well, that sounds perfect because without it, what do we do, right?
Yeah.
So amazing. And my drink of choice, I'm really boring today too. I mean, water is amazing, but no exciting recipes online except the filtration idea. That's pretty impressive, Brad. I'm just having herbal tea because often by the end of the evening, if I want to get a good night's sleep, I'll love to have a lovely herbal tea, berry or lemon ginger, or one of those many lovely flavors that we all have access to. So, no exciting recipes today, guys. Sorry, but hopefully, some of the other campfire chats, you'll get some interesting recipes to enjoy over the summer. So, today, our topic is really the donor journey. And I think I asked Brad on because we have gone through that journey together. And what I'd like to do is to start with Brad by asking, tell me a little bit about the motivation. You've actually had a history of giving, so maybe a
Yes.
little more than the average person. But why don't you tell me a little bit about your history of giving and what has motivated you to give back in your community?
Well, I guess as a worshiping Christian, that's just part of what we learn to do. And but I clearly have wanted to contribute, and it's out of a sense of gratitude for the things I have in my life that I want to be able to contribute back to others and to help them out. So it's always been a part of my package of things. I guess what really motivated me at looking at plan giving was. When my parents died, and I'd been thinking of some time about making preparations for uh, if what would happen when I died, or and as well, I began to plan for retirement. And at that point, I began to think about a financial advisor. But I think Janine, by the time we had met you, we'd already prepared our wills first, and we had done our first go at plan giving. So that was really moving on from next stage from my regular giving to trying to think about what might happen to me when I had died and what would happen to my estate.
Okay. Um, with the regards to what I want to do is share, I know a couple things that when we started working together, one of the things as an advisor that I tend to watch for is just understanding what priorities fit with the clients because everybody's different and everybody's going to have different objectives. And some of those fall naturally. And with Brad, with you, it did because it's always been a part of you. Um, as you said, the trigger of your parents dying and receiving some inheritance
Yes.
allowed you to recognize that you weren't going to need everything that you had.
Well, that was partly it. We didn't have a lot of money from that. I think it was more just the fact that I knew I had to begin to think about the future in a way that I hadn't before. But um, yeah, that was probably it more than just now I've got a package of money. What do I do with it? So I was really thinking more about retirement at that point and how to finance my retirement, and I wanted to make sure that I had enough money to retire adequately on, and that's when we began to seek your help and assistance. So,
Okay. Um, and tell us maybe about the process that you can recall when we started looking at uh, you and Elizabeth started looking at additional giving beyond just some donations each and every year.
well, that's really happened when her parents died, and suddenly we'd been doing our regular retirement planning with you for probably a dozen years or so, and we had not anticipated what the size of our parents' estate were. That was one thing that they've never shared with us, and I kind of regret that we didn't have that picture beforehand, but uh, we could have begun to discuss and to look perhaps more broadly, even further, and do better planning, perhaps. But we certainly when that came in about 6 or 7 years ago, suddenly we had a much larger package to be able to look at, and at that point. I had already thought about trust because I'd been involved with family trust before. I'd had a small inheritance and from my parents that involved a family trust, and my parents had a small family trust as well too. But I began to realize that that was rather complicated in managing that stuff. So you were the one that suggested trust to us again, and at that point, I expressed my reservations about trust in terms of how complicated it might be and what that might involve. So,
Okay. When we started, I know one of the discussions was starting to look at uh, with any client and with Brad and Elizabeth, one of the key things we had to do was look at exactly where they were. We need to know
mhm,
exactly where you are from an asset standpoint
mhm,
and what income you're going to need for the rest of your life.
right.
What taxes might be owing upon your death. And those sound like really simple conversations, but they still take a little bit of digging. They take a little bit of, uh, I guess, prodding, and Brad and Elizabeth had to do a little homework in terms of really understanding what their expenses were. Um, then what we also did is we took it to the next level and said, well, what if certain things happened? We never want to think about negative things happening, maybe dying early. But I think the biggest drain on finances that we have today is generally poor health in our later years.
Mhm.
And that can cost a lot of money. So, what would happen if, you ended up you needed additional care. I don't want to say ended up in a nursing home because not everybody wants to go there. And we have to respect what are your wishes and how do we manage that. So it's all cash flow based, but at least if we understand what the numbers are saying and know that you're taken care of, we can then move to the next stage of identifying here's what you need. You might not need all of this, but the longer we go, the more likely we are to know how much you're going to need, right?
And I think one of the things that happened that was interesting in our case is over the 20 years that we've been working together is we had that worked out, a package worked out based upon my pensions, on our RSPs and that sort of thing. But suddenly there was this amount of money that came into the picture that hadn't been planned for. And so we had to go back and rework it all again to decide what to do then. And at that point, the working through and the planning for retirement stuff, I thought we'd done a fairly good job at that point for planning our future. And we had settled a way that we would be able to look after uh, things that might occur like illnesses and chronic care. But with suddenly this package of money there was money there that we knew didn't have to be spent that way, and we could put it into giving. So
hmm Right. And so again, and as financial planning is an ongoing chapter, anybody who's run a business knows you might set up a business plan, but nothing ever goes exactly as planned. So, you always are taking a little bit of a turn, identifying what you need to do. And so we went back and rejigged the numbers to figure out where we are
mhm.
and what we could do.
Yeah,
And I'm going to get into the other process in a minute, but I want to just finish talking about the numbers piece because it's probably the most boring, but it's still important to have that
hmm,
precedent set. Um, so what we did is we also identified that at this age, there are more things that could happen, and if we were ill for longer it would cost more money. So what we identified is that absolutely some additional charitable giving, planned giving, could be done, um, both uh, in the wills and also additional giving each and every year. So we actually set up a 10-year plan because we knew that in 10 years, if everybody had made it through and there was no health issues, that and we'd had reasonable markets and all the other assumptions that you make when you do these plannings, that you would be in a very good position. You would have made a substantial donation, but we didn't do it all at once, so if things took a turn for the worse, it wasn't going to impact you in the future.
right.
So that, I think that was an approach that worked because it gave us comfort level to build up, but we didn't have to do everything at once. um, there
Yeah,
was no big tax trigger in this case to mean that we had to make a big conversation
that's
or
right.
make a bigger decision all at once. So that was one thing. And that so far, I think I'm thinking, are we 5 or 6 years into that plan about now?
Yes, we are. Yeah, we
Okay.
are. Yeah, we worked our wills about that time as well too, and so that's all part of the package. I think of doing uh, regularly reviewing your estate planning every 5 years or so, and so you've helped us do that and reminded us when we have to review things again. And as I say, in that review course, what happened to us was suddenly we had money that we hadn't planned for, and what could we do with that?
So one of the things I want to just mention is that if people know that they have options and we know that we're taking care of those that we're that we must, all of a sudden it opens up so many opportunities. So sometimes people want to jump ahead to the next step, but at least if we have the base, we can confirm that it's easy to move forward. Now we can do planning, we can do more charitable giving and look at the options. So all of that number stuff is great and important, but I think the even or more interesting part of the journey is identifying what it is that you want to do and what I guess, causes or beliefs you want to start to get involved with. So I know we had some discussions around that. Why don't you share with us a little bit, Brad, of that piece of the puzzle, and then we'll get into a few of those steps we took.
When we originally began to do our estate plan together, my wife has a background in journalism, so her interest in causes that she was supporting were things like Amnesty International and that sort of thing. And she, out of her income, donated to her causes. I, out of my income, donated to my causes. And as a person who was grateful to the church for having employment and so forth, my planning basically at the beginning in those days was centered on giving back to my church, and that's what would happen with my estate. But when we have this new money in place, we had to begin to look again at what could be done and what we should be doing. And at that point, we had to begin to bring together our two different goals together, partly because our lawyer, as we were planning our wills at that point, said, you know, the way you set it up in your wills originally in the first stage that we did 10 or 15 years ago, what we saw is you left money to your people. Your wife has left money to the people that she wanted to designate it to, and so that means if one of you survives, the other person things that they wanted to allot their money to will not be funded. And so, what might be some common things that you would be looking at so that it isn't a winner take all sort of thing, depending upon who outlasts the other one. That's and we had to begin to do some discussion and bring together our thoughts about what we might be able to look at that had a common focus, and we could begin to put that into our planning.
Right. We don't laugh too much when we're writing our wills, but the winner take all scenario comes up almost every single time I'm dealing with couples when there's some differences. And I mean, obviously, as individuals, we always have differences in our total ideas.
Mhm.
And one big part of, I think, the lawyer's job when they're writing the estate, the will, and helping to deal with the estate, and the advisor's job, if they're helping to move forward with the planning, is just trying to identify what are the common differences, or what are the differences and what are the common elements. Because if you're one and also what are the steps that we need to deal with in a will, we're not going to get into all that today, to make sure that both of your wishes are being honored, because it doesn't happen very often that we both die at the same time, right? So that both spouses, so identifying how those can be met and moving forward is an important piece, and that's something where when philanthropy is involved with the will, it's often important to have a proper lawyer involved so they can help deal with those situations. Um, One of the things that I think is important is also identifying often the causes. For example, you, Brad, and Elizabeth, there could be differences, but there's also common elements. And sometimes we don't know all the charities that would deal with those common elements. So I know part of your journey has been also looking at where you want to donate and recognizing what was most important to you at this stage of life. Do you want to share a little bit about your thoughts and discussions on that?
Well, one of the things we have both shared as an interest together has been in the environment, and so what we began to recognize is that that might be a common thing for us to begin to look at. And so that began to be part of the criteria for the investment vehicles that we might use in terms of our planning as well too. And we begin to set that up as a criteria for, as we talked about this 10-year plan and being able to put money aside, a certain amount of money each year over the 10 years. We looked at what might be the vehicle to do that that would help not only address environmental concerns, but also be uh, invested in a way that put in a way that was going to meet our goals as well too.
Right. Okay. And uh, so that got into different causes, different charities. But what it also gave us was, because one of your priorities, we started looking at environmental type investing. So
Right.
some of you on the call might be familiar: ESG, environmental, social, and governance, or SRI. Those are the two common phrases that are used for socially responsible investing. And really, what it means is that there's a focus to not invest in things that are detrimental to our environment, or socially unjust, etc. So looking at that avenue and knowing that there was we were doing homework in the causes and exactly where the funds wanted to go. It wasn't that there was one charity at the forefront. Um, as you said, Brad, the environment was one. I believe housing and Indigenous and trust were two other causes that
That
have
that
become more important to you.
indeed that came up, but I think it more came up once we had an investment vehicle. And so one of the things that we looked at is rather than looking at trust because of their complications, was looking at donor designated funds. And so we had some options there. We had some of the banks offer those. The Toronto Foundation offers one. I think even CI offers one now as well too. And so uh, we wanted to make sure that those vehicles that we might use to direct our money would be not only ensure that the money would go where we wanted it to go, but it would also be, as I say, it wouldn't be invested in vehicles that are not socially responsible.
Right.
So once we used that as a criteria, we found a donor designated fund, Make Way, which uh, has as its main focus looking at helping out organizations that are indigenous, helping out groups that are they rose originally looking at some of the issues in the West Coast with the environment, and so that became a vehicle that was going to not only invest our money responsibly, but also one that we could use as a and feel good about using because it met our goals. And so as we began to talk with them, they helped us to begin to say, where would we want to designate the money? Now we have a donor designated fund. Where do we want to specify that that money goes? And so that began to be, we had to begin to bring our interests even more together. We had to think about, okay, we've got the environment. That's something that's been really forefront for both of us. We've got my interest had been also working with indigenous people since I worked with homeless people. And it also meant there was an urban focus to what we were doing because I'd worked in a city and an inner city with homeless people, a good portion of whom were indigenous people. And so at that point, we began to focus on indigenous housing as being a real focus for where we wanted to see those donor designated funds going to. And that's what we began to specify. And as we began to rework our wills and so forth, that got written into our wills. So it's not just the 10-year plan that we're looking at in terms of the money going into and our ongoing designation each year of our gifts going into indigenous housing in an urban setting, but also where our final wills, our estate when it's settled, it'll be directed that way as well too.
Hmm. So I want to touch on a little bit more about our. I was engaged with the decision, so I can say that.
Right.
But the decision that you made to use donor advised funds. Charities always love the fact that they can be written into a will and, of course, want to be the first beneficiary. But I
Right.
think that because there was a lot of decisions to be made and it was a longer term plan, you wanted a little flexibility to be able to make certain changes. So we had certain priorities we identified up front.
That's right.
One of them you've already addressed was you found the environment was really important. So finding an investment vehicle, and maybe some charities have that, but specifically an investment, if we decided to go with a donor advised fund, an investment vehicle that was ESG. And that was really important. I think that was probably our number one priority at
Right.
the time. Um, and helping, maybe getting some assistance to learning more about the areas of interest, um, and 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 maybe supporting the research that you wanted to do to find the right charities that you could donate to. Is that a fair statement?
Right. I mean, Elizabeth and I basically did that research on our own. Once we knew where once we'd been helped to look at, we were going to need to bring together our two different ideas and try to find a common focus. Once we've been able to identify that, then we began to look at organizations that might fit in, um, local organizations that might fit into that. Who is it that is offering indigenous housing in an urban setting? And I picked an organization that did general housing, permanent housing for uh, homeless people who were indigenous. Elizabeth was interested in making sure that women were covered in that, so we found another one that would be focused on women and making sure that they had stable housing. So that's the kind of thinking that we were doing as we went through this process of trying to come together with a common focus.
Okay. So one of the things that we did do, and I'm just going to go back and touch on the donor advised fund decision at the beginning, is once a few criteria were determined, what we were trying to do is find an organization that had the ESG on the investment side that could provide a little bit of support in finding some of the charities, just
Hmm.
because you didn't know, you were going to do your own research, but you wanted some confirmation from them and I think comfort
Right.
level at the beginning, and that had a similar focus in that area.
Hmm.
Is that sounds
Well,
reasonable?
as I say, I think most of the research we did ourselves on
Yeah.
trying to find, and I kind of knew something in the background. I think the other thing I wanted to mention though was we wanted to make sure that there was some flexibility with in terms of how we defined the our donor designated fund. We wanted to make sure, with my experience with nonprofits, is sometimes their mandate changes over time or they evolve in ways and they may no longer fit in with that kind of goal or focus that we wanted to. So we wanted to make sure that we could move the money from one place to another, from one group to another if we needed to do that. The other thing was that we were helped, I think, by the donor designated by Makeway, is to make sure that we weren't specifying things so tightly in terms of our focus that the organizations that we were trying to fund would find themselves too entailed so that they couldn't, the money wouldn't go anyplace. So that can happen as well too.
Right. Okay. So we did a little homework on which donor advised funds had the focus, which at the time, interesting, we didn't find a lot that had ESG. I know that's changed a bit in the last few years for
Mm.
some of you on the calls that might know that. But at the time, there wasn't that many, and that was part of how we ended up with the selection process. You know what? All 30 minutes is almost up. So we've touched on a number of things. I'm just wondering if there's any two or three tips that you would like to leave for our listeners, Brad, about the donor and dealing with the donor and what priorities they should be considering when they're
Well,
speaking with you.
certainly feedback from the donors is important. Is getting thank yous back to people and letting them know what you've been doing with your money. That's probably the most important thing is regular communication once a gift has been made, I think, and particularly if it's a regular gift like we're doing. So we want to know, we want to have that information about what it is that we're doing, and I think that's pretty common sense. Probably most of you are doing that, but I just want to underline it. So.
I think we've also highlighted that often the time for these conversations when there's some kind of a trigger event, starting to plan for your retirement, doing a full financial plan, whatever triggered that, so that we see where you're going to fall, what taxes might be owing, um, asking the question. You guys were givers, for lack of a better
Mhm.
word, but I know that at many of the conversations and meetings that we've had, I also asked the question, is this something, are you interested in this? I knew from your tax return you were, because we review that, but that's something that doesn't happen all the time. So I think it's important for both the donor and the advisor to keep in mind that let's talk about it. Is this something that's important to you? And sometimes that's shut down, but other times it's just looking at different ideas and how can this work? And we did look at a few different ideas to identify how it worked. So those trigger conversations and being there at the right time. Um, and I also think asking questions is important because the donor has ideas that they might want to have, but they might not have thought they could ever do this. Sometimes you find yourself in a different position. And Brad, I think you and Elizabeth were you had ideas of wanting to do it, but often people can do it and they're not aware. because they've never thought they'd ever be in that position before. So that's where sometimes the numbers can back up, but getting people to think is really important. Um, I think I'm trying to think if there's any other tips that I want to leave with you. Brad, is there anything you'd like to leave the group with?
Well, our case is a little bit simpler because we don't have children, of course, and didn't have immediate heirs to pass the money on to. So that's another consideration as well, too. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's something that can be, that is always being considered. But what I also have found in many cases where there are children, creating some legacy becomes a bit of a family, uh, it's almost like the family legacy, so that it helps to bind the family together in how they want to give and how they want to move forward with some common elements, and helping to give that that opportunity to give back to your community, to be engaged, is something that can we can all support, and in many different ways. Whether if it's not money, it might be time. So I guess I want to say thank you so much, Brad, for
You're
sharing
welcome.
some of your ideas. It's a pleasure to talk to you and work with you. And I really hope that there's a few tidbits here that each of you can take away and think about. What are you having with your conversations? Are you allowing the client to lead them, but maybe helping to direct them, or just suggesting different options that will get them where they want to be, even if they don't always know where it is? I think Brad and Elizabeth had a pretty good idea. So guiding them and helping them with the journey was an easier job, but some people don't. But it's about the right time and the right conversation and making sure the client is engaged. So I thank you so much for your day. Everybody have a wonderful summer, and hopefully you'll be showing up for the next session, the next Campfire Chats, which is in August, and I know featuring Tina Terentian. And thank you. Have a great day. Take care, everybody.